This Talkback presentation is about multicultural education and avoiding misconceptions regarding special education, gender bias, and the self-fulfilling prophecy. The topics covered today will be about culturally responsive special education in inclusive schools, gender bias from colonial America to today's classroom, the self-fulfilling prophecy, and then we will end with our reflection questions. First up, culturally responsive special education in inclusive schools. The learning outcomes include: what does it mean when special education is described as exclusion? How to increase parental involvement and establish a strong support system for all involved? How to have a culturally responsive and inclusive classroom? Ways to prevent misdiagnosis and disproportionality? And examples of mainstreaming and inclusion. Special education emerged at the same time as civil rights movement, and this represented the value of equality of educational opportunity for students who were being denied access to high quality schooling to meet their learning needs. One of the major cases from this time was the Brown versus the Board of Education. Many of the court cases that happened around this time benefited all groups of students that were being pushed away by the education system. When segregation of both special needs and racially, ethnic, and diverse students ended, there was a limited availability of teachers who were skilled in teaching diverse students. And this was because of a lack of preparation from the state and school districts, and because of resistance to teaching in a diverse setting. Wow. Special education was now breaking down walls that had caused harmful restrictions on people's education and lives. It was also being used in a negative way regarding children of diverse backgrounds, which could include race, socioeconomic status, and language barriers. And they also started to notice that there was now an increase in misdiagnosis and disproportionality. Special education as exclusion. When special education is described as exclusion instead of inclusion, it is talking about using special education as another way to single out and segregate children based on their race and socioeconomic status, but in a legal way to where they wouldn't receive any backlash at this time. Um, Special education and segregation. Because teachers and schools were not prepared or taught how to teach in a diverse classroom, they usually would label students from lower SES and those that did not have English as their first language as special education. And these teachers thought these students had learning and behavioral problems. After 1980s, there was now a noticeable pattern of overrepresentation of ethnic and cultural minorities in the special education department. This was now a new form of discrimination and exclusion. These problems reflect the school's lack of readiness for diversity because they were not able to help these students like they needed to be helped. Schools used special education as a net for children that needed extra support in the classroom. Again, this was because the lack of teacher skills and preparation. A lot of these children that were placed into the special education usually did not have any intellectual or learning disabilities. It was just due to the teacher's lack of willingness to teach and lack of preparation. In 2004, the IDIA, or Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, was established to reinforce the accountability of state and local education agencies for addressing the disproportional representation of CLD students by ethnic racial groups across disability categories. Strategies to prevent misdiagnosis and disproportionality. So, schools should avoid using a one size fits all approach when using the assessments and interventions with these students. Schools should also support teachers in their instructional strategies. And within that, teachers should build on students' social, linguistic, and cultural experiences to make lessons more meaningful in the classroom. Um, Schools should also provide proper training for teachers so they can meet CLD students' cultural and linguistic needs. Teachers should show that they have provided evidence-based intervention to CLD students before referring them to special education. This could include things such as RTI, which is another type of intervention. And these interventions that are being used should maximize student achievements and reduce behavior problems. Teachers should also possess positive beliefs and attitudes toward these students. To continue with prevention, one of the major provisions of IDEA is the non-discriminatory assessment, and this is because of the court case of Larry P. versus Riles in 1971. So, in order for students to have these assessments, parents must consent to IQ exams and assessments for disability eligibility. These assessments must be administered by trained and knowledgeable personnel. All the measures should be valid and reliable. Eligibility and placement can't be determined on the results of one single test, so there has to be multiple versions. And assessments must be given in a child's native language. So, as I was saying with RTI is a response to intervention, and it's usually in a three-tier pyramid like we see. There's sometimes a fourth level, but it's just the main three for now. Um, the purpose of RTI is for screening for early identification and prevention. It focuses on effective instruction and evidence-based practices, and opens up the option for disability determination. So you begin with Tier 1, and this is the core classroom instruction. It involves all students, so it's your basic everyday today teaching in the classroom, nothing nothing out of the ordinary, just in the classroom. And so when you're teaching with Tier 1, if you start to notice that a student may need extra help in some areas, then you can move them up to Tier 2. And again, this is only for some students, and they are divided into smaller groups, and they have frequent progress monitoring. So this is just where the teacher makes sure that they're hitting their goals like they have planned, and if they're not, then maybe they're changing the way that they're teaching them. But if they continue to have these challenges, then they'll move up to Tier 3, and Tier 3 is the intensive individual instruction. And again, this is with students with persistent challenges, ones that they're just not resolving or meeting the checks like they should be, and this is only a few students. And this is usually when disability determination is introduced. So benefits from parental participation. It's very important to have parents be involved in their students' educations and as teachers to want their help. Um, Students benefit academically, socially, and emotionally when they see their parents being involved with their teachers and their teachers and being involved with their parents. Parents get an increased confidence, they have high self esteem, and they just have a better understanding of the school and their child's education. Um, they just want to feel more involved, and that's very important in this. The teacher benefits include getting an increased knowledge of the child that they're working with. They're open to more opportunities to learn about new cultures, and they establish strong communication within the child support system. This would be parents, staff, anybody involved. Reasons why there might be a lack of parent participation. So, parents might have differing views when it comes to their child's values, such as interdependence instead of independence from parents. It could also be a result of educators having limited knowledge of diverse cultures and their failure to understand how their own values and beliefs could influence their teaching. Parents could feel like they're not valued or respected by the school staff. They could feel like their requests for information are being ignored, or that they're even being blamed for their child's difficulties. Parents may also feel uncomfortable in a school setting because of their own negative experiences. They feel like their child's weaknesses are the sole focus of discussions. And even the educators may have low expectations for their children. And so this can make them not want to be as involved. Ways to increase parental participation. This is specifically when arranging a meeting, such as an IEP meeting, which can be very intimidating, and so it's very important that all parties involved are comfortable, especially the parents. So you can do this by inviting parents to bring siblings, extended family members, or community members to support them and their child. Allow time for small talk. A lot of times in these meetings, there's a strict schedule that everyone involved has to stick to, and this can kind of seem kind of cut off. So it's very important to allow time to have these small conversations with parents so they can feel a little bit more at ease and less intimidated. Um, Provide food, transportation, and childcare facilities. Be flexible with scheduling. Offer to record meetings for absent members. Provide documentations in native languages and have a translator available if needed. Parents can also choose to bring someone they know to translate for them if they are more comfortable with that. Ways to increase parental participation, this time in a more branched out version. Parent professional collaboration should happen throughout the entire special education, not just in these meetings. And it's being done by including them in all decision making, be flexible again with meeting times and types of meetings. So you can offer in person, over the phone, video conference, just whatever works best for the educator and the parents. Um, Make the school culturally welcoming by celebrating important cultural days and festivals. Utilize person-centered planning. So this involves like asking parents for input on intervention plans. Offer community sources and services within the school, such as parent support groups, recreational clubs, childcare, and language and literacy learning centers. In order for these to work, though, schools must be cooperative and respectful when responding to parent and community values.
This slide discusses potential steps to take to build a strong relationship between the family and the school. The first step that I wanted to talk about was the professional education needs to be multi-focused and have an intersectional approach. The research showed that this factor has contributed highly. In the article that I read, I also learned that research and data showed that students were assigned to a family that has a child with a disability that comes from a different culture of the student's own. They accompany them on everyday tasks such as going to the grocery store or other tasks like that and spend quality time. Studies show this practice significantly increased a teacher's pre-education and their commitment to keep the parents involved in their child's education. I think this is important and shows that the family would feel more comfortable with the student that's in pre-education that would eventually be at school every day with their child. This next slide talks about the practices that will result in an inclusive and culturally responsive classroom. The first practice that I talked about would be to have an examination to be upheld for teachers that discuss their beliefs, culture, biases, etc. The examination would be followed by learning how these factors can influence others when teaching. I think this would just be good to have for teachers to do an examination so their peers know where they're at and what's going on in the classroom and making sure that all the students feel comfortable. The second practice is upholding an investigation to see how CLD students are affected by not being the majority culture and then acting on that investigation. The third practice is incorporating more aspects and teaching techniques of a minority culture into all parts of the school curriculum. Why is special education described as exclusion? Based on my readings of the article and just what I thought about and what I've experienced in my school district, my public high school, this is just kind of what I thought about this topic. Based on the developmental stage of a student with special needs, different teachers, different curriculum, and even different peers need to be enforced for most. These students have specific needs that must be met in order to be successful. This is why special education is considered exclusive. Public schools are trying to find more ways to make their education system mainstream, but this population requires special and extra accommodations. This slide discusses potential steps to take to build a strong relationship between the family and the school. The first step that I wanted to talk about was the professional education needs to be multi-focused and have an intersectional approach. The research showed that this factor has contributed highly. In the article that I read, I also learned that research and data showed that students were assigned to a family that has a child with a disability that comes from a different culture of the student's own. They accompany them on everyday tasks such as going to the grocery store or other tasks like that and spend quality time. Studies show this practice significantly increased a teacher's pre-education and their commitment to keep the parents involved in their child's education. I think this is important and shows that the family would feel more comfortable with the student that's in pre-education that would eventually be at school every day with their child. This slide explains what mainstreaming or inclusion is, as well as gives an example of that. An example of mainstreaming is the practice of bringing special needs students into a regular classroom. This is based on their individual skill level, but they would be experiencing inclusion and mainstreaming. Critics want to shift the focus of the disproportionality of students, including their socioeconomic status, the language they speak, and their developmental stage. The new focus would be visiting the culture of a mainstream/inclusive public school system that reinforces existing disparities. My works cited is on the next slide, but
This is Annie Bryden, and I'll be talking about the gender bias from colonial America to today's classroom. This chapter provides a context for understanding gender bias in school. It includes a brief historical overview of women's struggle for educational opportunity, an update of the progress made and yet to be made in ensuring gender equity in schools, an analysis of gender bias in curricula, insights into gender bias in instruction, a view of today's trends and challenges concerning gender issues in school, and some practical suggestions for creating gender equitable classrooms. The hidden civil rights struggle. For centuries, women fought to open the schoolhouse door. The education of America's girls was so limited that less than one-third of the women in colonial America could even sign their names. During the colonial period, dame schools educated very young boys and girls in the homes of women who had the time and desire to teach. Girls lucky enough to attend such schools would learn domestic schools along with reading, purely so that they could one day read the Bible to their children. Such schools also taught the boys how to write and prepared them for more formal education. Girls graduated to the kitchen and the sewing area, focusing on their futures as wives and mothers. With the new democracy came new ideas and the promise of more educational opportunities for females. Elementary schools gradually opened their doors to females, and for the families financially able, secondary schools in the form of female seminaries became possible. Seminaries provided a protected and supervised climate, melding religious and academic lessons. In New York, Emma Hart Willard battled to establish the Troy Female Seminary, and in Massachusetts, Mary Leon created Mount Holyoke, a seminary that eventually became a noted women's college. Seminaries often emphasized self-denial and strict discipline, considered important elements in molding devout women, wives, and Christian mothers. By the 1850s, with help from Quakers such as Harriet Beecher Stowe, Martilla Minor established the Minor Normal School for colored girls in the nation's capital, providing new educational opportunities for African American women. Because school was seen as an extension of the home and another arena for rising children, seminary graduates were allowed to become teachers, at least until they decided to marry. More than 80% of the graduates of Troy Female Seminary and Mount Holyoke became teachers. Female teachers were particularly attractive to school districts, not only because of their teaching effectiveness, but also because they were typically paid one-third to one-half the salary of male teachers. In Sex and Education, Dr. Edward Clark, a member of Harvard's medical faculty, argued that women attending high school and college were at medical risk. According to Dr. Clark, the blood destined for the development and health of their ovaries would be redirected to their brains by the stress of study. With the passage of Title IX of the Educational Amendments of 1972, females saw significant progress toward gaining access to educational programs, but not equality. Title IX became law as the women's movement gained momentum, yet it applies to males as well as females. Report cards: the cost of sexism in schools. When it came to academic attitudes, boys often viewed reading and writing as feminine subjects that threatened their masculinity. College men have fewer intellectual interests and poorer study habits than college women. They enjoy reading books less, take fewer notes, study less, and play more. But despite their lower effort, lower grades, and lower likelihood of completing a college degree, men evaluate their academic abilities higher than those of women. Before Title IX, fewer than 300,000 high school girls played competitive sports. Today, 3 million girls compete, but they are only about 40% of all high school athletes. Girls' teams typically have less visibility and status than male teams, and are often denied the same benefits like adequate facilities and financial support. As girls go through school, their self-esteem often plummets and the danger of depression increases. In middle school, girls rate popularity as more important than academic competence or independence. Eating disorders among females in schools and colleges are rampant and increasing. Men have been the majority of college students from the colonial period to the early 1980s. Today, women are the majority. Yet it is not white men who are missing from the college ranks, but minority and low-income men. 1 year after college graduation, a female of any racial, ethnic, or socioeconomic group earns less than a white male with the same college degree. Gender bias in the curriculum. When children read about people in non-traditional gender roles, they are less likely to limit themselves to stereotypes. When children read about women and minorities in history, they are more likely to believe that these groups have made important contributions to the country. As one sixth grader told us, "I love to read biographies about women. When I learn about what they've done, I feel like a door is opening. If they can do great things, maybe I can too." But what if your identity is misrepresented, misremembered, or just plain missing from the school curriculum? Here are a few ways about how to detect gender bias in books when teaching. Invisibility. Many of today's textbooks continue to give minimal treatment to women, depriving students of information about half of the nation's population. When we ask students to name 10 famous women from American history, most cannot do it. Stereotyping. When rigid roles or traits are assigned to all members of a group, a stereotype that denies individual attributes and differences is born. Imbalance and selectivity. Curricula sometimes present only one interpretation of an issue, situation, or group of people, simplifying and distorting complex issues by omitting different perspectives. Unreality. When the nuclear family is described only as a father, mother, and 2 children, students are being treated to romanticized and sanitized narratives. Fragmentation. A textbook may place information about women in a special box or insert, separating the discussion from the main narrative. Such isolation presents women and gender issues as interesting diversions, but not part of the mainstream of history, literature, or the sciences. Linguistic bias. The exclusive use of masculine terms and pronouns ranging from our forefathers, mankind, and businessmen to the generic he denies the full participation and recognition of women. Cosmetic bias. This offers an illusion of equity. Until publishers and authors eliminate gender bias, it will be up to the creativity and commitment of teachers and parents to fill in the missing pages. Children enjoy exciting, well-written books, and such books can include characters from diverse races, ethnic groups, religions, social classes, and both genders. Many school practices assume that all people are heterosexual and either male or female. A typical curriculum reflects this assumption in subtle and not so subtle ways. Literature such as Romeo and Juliet, math word problems such as David bought Karen 1 dozen roses, and electing a homecoming king and queen are obvious examples of assumed heterosexuality for all. However, some schools are altering these practices, inviting same sex couples to the prom, providing gender neutral or individual bathrooms and locker rooms for transgender students, and including LGBT people and perspectives in the curriculum. Here are a few strategies for creating gender fair classrooms. Discuss the issue directly with your students. It is entirely appropriate to acknowledge that instructional materials are not always perfect. Ask your students to list famous men and women. Does the list include individuals of diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds? What groups are missing from their lists? How can we learn more about those missing Americans? Analyze your seating assignments to determine whether there are pockets of racial, ethnic, class, or gender segregation in your classroom. When your students work in groups, create groups that reflect diversity and monitor these groups to ensure equitable participation and decision making. Do not tolerate the use of harmful words, bullying, or harassment in your classroom. Do not say boys will be boys to excuse sexist comments or behaviors. As a teacher, you are the model and the norm setter. If you do not tolerate hurtful prejudice, your students will learn to honor and respect one another. And lastly, continue your own reading and professional development in gender equity. Be careful that your rights or those of your colleagues are not violated by gender discrimination. Thank you.
Okay, now we're going to look at the self-fulfilling prophecy. What is the self-fulfilling prophecy? The self-fulfilling prophecy is a preconceived belief that impacts the way you behave, causing the belief to become true. This belief is usually false, but it still finds its way into influencing your actions. In summary, your beliefs influence your actions and the results of those actions. Now we're going to look at who does the self-fulfilling prophecy affect. Number 1, students who are expected to perform well in school due to their parents' success in the community are often affected by the self-fulfilling prophecy. These students are called tokenized students. Number 2, low-income students and students of color are often affected by the self-fulfilling prophecy. And number 3, students who have any prejudice placed against them. This could be a teacher that does not believe in them, parents who place too high of expectations on the student, their peers who they assume are better than them. So really, the self-fulfilling prophecy could affect any and all of your students in your classroom. Okay, now we're going to look at an example of the self-fulfilling prophecy from the reading. From our reading, the example mentioned was about a student who is taking a test in a location where he or she knew that cultural bias was present. When the student realized that cultural bias was present, it led to a 5 to 8% loss of points on the test for the student. A second factor was then added, and that factor was the student's discomfort due to the minority effect. The student felt that he was a part of a minority, and he lost an additional 10 to 15% of points on the test because of that. Furthermore, if the student was a teenager dealing with frustration or anxiety while taking the test, the student was likely to score an additional 10% loss on the test. And so all of this together led to a 30% loss on the test, and the student underperformed compared to his peers because of his own self-fulfilling prophecy. The self-fulfilling prophecy can have a tremendous effect on students' academic performance, and it can lead to an increase in referrals for special education services for students who perform less on tests. The self-fulfilling prophecy in this example came about because of a cultural bias that was present in the minority effect, and it led this student to be referred for special education services. Okay, now what does the self-fulfilling prophecy lead to? So number 1, the self-fulfilling prophecy leads to poor academic or cognitive achievement in students who are impacted by this issue. And number 2, it leads to a disproportionality of students of color in special education programs. Obviously, this is a huge issue. for teachers because we don't want any of our students to fail or to not get the help that they need to succeed. And I'm sure that all of us have faced a self-fulfilling prophecy in our own lives before. I know that I have. My teacher always believed that I was terrible at math, and I wasn't very good at math, but that's beside the point. So then I started believing that I was terrible at math, and it caused me to fail my math test and perform very badly in math. But then one day I decided that I wasn't going to be bad at math anymore, and I changed my mindset and I worked on it, and now I would say I am decently good at math and I make good grades in my math classes. And so that's an example of the self-fulfilling prophecy in my own life. So I think any student can face that. Okay, so recommendations for teachers. Number 1, remember that humanity exists in your classroom. So a lot of us as future teachers, we think we're going to go into the classroom one day and we're going to have some troubled students, but most of our students are going to be really well behaved. They're going to complete their assignments on time. They're going to focus. They're going to be very attentive to the lessons that we teach, but that's just not the case. Humanity exists in our classrooms, and with humanity comes problems. No one is perfect. We all know that, and so we're going to have problems in our classroom. We need to be preparing for that and know that that's going to happen, not have unrealistic expectations for our future classrooms. Okay, number 2, we need to evaluate our own perceptions and consider how we can change them. So we all have preconceived beliefs in our minds, whether conscious or unconscious, about different religions and cultures and things like that. We need to work on broadening our perspective so that we can be the teacher we need to be for all of our students. Number 3, we need to ensure that our assessments of our students is not subjective. So we need to make sure that we're grading our students based on each individual student and not just on standard, because every student has different things going on. And if we know that one of our students was really struggling the day we gave an assessment and they performed way below what they usually perform, I think it's important to take that into account and maybe help that student and give that student an extra opportunity to make up those points. Number 4, we need to recognize that nothing can adequately prepare us to handle the diversity in our classroom. No matter how many classes we have in college on diversity and cultures and different things like that that are present in the classroom, when we get into our own classroom one day, it is going to be shocking because there's going to be so many things that we didn't realize were going to be there, and we're going to have to prepare and learn more about different cultures and our students' backgrounds so that we can include them in the classroom and be the teachers that we need to be. It's a growing process, so we just need to remember that. Okay, here are reflection questions. Number 1, were your parents involved in your education, and if so, how? If they were not involved in your education, who played a crucial role in your education, and how did they do so? Number 2, what is your experience with the self-fulfilling prophecy? How did you overcome the issues associated with the self-fulfilling prophecy? Thank you for listening.